Welcome to Excel Smart. Today's product is Lookup and Look Great. 11 tips. 11 tips? I thought I went up to 12 tips. 11 or more tips for Excel lookup function projects. Now, in today's project, what we're going to be doing is building a little tool for comparing fantasy football player statistics using lookup functions. Now, a few concepts here. The reason why we're presenting these tips in the context of a project is because that's going to make these tips a lot easier to remember. Otherwise, just random tips out of nowhere. It's tough to digest them. And this is something you can look forward to with all Excel Smart videos, is focusing on practicality. Not always going to be the most advanced functions in Excel, but let's be real, we don't always use those. I've been using Excel at an advanced level for over 20 years, both in a corporate environment and for hobbies and personal use. So I'm going to try and use that experience as best I can to focus on the most applicable Excel tips. If you want to get the most out of this video, some prerequisites that may be useful. Having an understanding of Excel functions will be useful. Having an understanding of cell references and just knowing, for example, what cell A1 is, that's useful. And then obviously copy and paste is going to help you with almost anything. So I recommend knowing how those work. If you like videos on those prerequisites, let me know in the comments. Perhaps we'll get some on the Excel Smart channel. All right, so let's get started. Pull up the screen share. On screen now is some fantasy football quarterback data that has been copied and pasted from the Yahoo Sports website. Is copy and pasting the smoothest way to get data from the internet into your Excel workbook? No, but it's fast and we do it all the time. We're gonna try and help you do it effectively here. So what we have is a bunch of data, but it's formatted. You see we got links here. We got merge cells. This isn't gonna work for our lookup functions. When you have a lookup function, you wanna be looking up a data set that is clean. You have data on each row. You don't have a lot of blanks. You have column headers. This data doesn't meet that bar yet. So the first step here in tip number 1 today for getting our data to look like that is using paste values. Microsoft Excel has several paste functions, it's called paste special. So first I'm gonna copy this data. I have this all selected. I'm gonna open a new sheet. I'm going to copy it, but I'm gonna do paste special values. There are a number of ways to do this. If you're new to pasting special, perhaps the best way here is just to go up to the home ribbon. You see where we have the paste icon. Click this little arrow that points to the different versions of paste special that are available to you. Paste values is right here. You can just type, my mouse is covering it. You can just type letter V or click on the 1, 2, 3. And what Excel has done now, it has pasted only the values from the cells that we copied. So it's ignored the hyperlinks. It's ignored any little images that might have made it through there. It's not pasting any cell formatting, so nothing here is underlined, for example. And we're a little bit closer to clean data, but we're not there yet. As I mentioned before, we want to have data that has no blank rows, and we have some rows here that aren't usable. The player name, you can see Josh Allen here at the beginning of the player name, is on the same row as his statistics, which is a nice start. But then we have his most recently played game and player note. We don't need that. Because we know how this data looks and because we're only dealing with a very tiny data set for today's project, what we can do here is use the filter to try and get this a little bit cleaner. On the home ribbon, if you move over to sort and filter, which is in the editing section up here, you can apply filters to our selected data set. I haven't even touched anything. I still have the whole area selected that I just pasted. You can grab any of these columns where if you look down in the column, you have a bunch of the blanks, because what we're going to do is use the filter to remove the blanks from the cells we can see. So you can kind of start to see what this data is going to look like when we're done. So we have a couple of columns here that have characters that are not useful. These question mark characters, we don't need this, but what we're going to do is we're going to select what data we actually do want to keep. So I'm going to definitely keep the player names here, including the header of the column. So long as I start from the same row and finish in the same row, I can copy another section of the table. I can skip over the fantasy team names, for example, and I can skip over to games played and highlight this area. I'm going to copy this and paste this into sheet 3. And we have this what's almost a clean data set. The last problem here is that the headers aren't really useful. You can see because Yahoo had data on multiple lines and wrapped text, it didn't come through. So I'm going to take a minute off camera here just to clean up these headers to make them say what I want them to say.
A few moments later.
And we're back. The data as it stands now is actually the way I want it. I just want to be able to read it better. So again, I'm not going to count this as one of the 11 tips, but if you highlight all the columns of the data here, you can adjust the sizing on the columns so that they all fit. You can read everything. All you have to do once you've selected these columns here is just choose the gap to the right of any one column. So for example, I'm to the right of column O here, and I'm just going to double click. And now every selected column has been sized to the widest text string in that column. And our data is relatively clean. I'm going to actually hide sheet 1 here and hide sheet 2. I could delete them, but there's not a lot of memory being used. Those are small sheets, so just hiding them isn't going to slow down the workbook or anything. So I'm just going to hide them just in case there's something I decide I want later. So if I wanted one of the columns I didn't select, I can go back and do that. We can improve on the way this data is organized. It's going to make our lookup functions in the future much nicer and enable some other functions in Excel. So this brings us to tip number 2, format as table. The way we have the data arranged here is technically called a range. It's not in Excel terms a table. So this range actually is simply from cell A1 to T26. That's the range. We want this data to be a table. There's an Excel function in the ribbon that can perform that for us. What's actually nice, we don't need to manually select the data either because we have clean data where we have headers and no real blanks. All we have to do is select somewhere within this range. You can hit Control A and go up to the ribbon here in the home ribbon, format as table. You can pick your favorite table. I'm going to go with orange here to stay on brand for Excel Smart. And you can see it already is going to work with the selection we have. We have checked off that my table has headers because it does. And there you go. It is now formatted as a table. What this means is we effectively have a bunch of named ranges. If you go up to where your workbook here usually just says the cell that you're in, click this drop down, you'll see now there's this thing here called Table 1. Table 1 is all of the data within the table. I'm going to undo this real quick just to show another way to do this. If I just have my cursor selected anywhere in the table, I went to format as table, it's going to guess and actually guesses correctly on what range I need. I don't actually need to highlight it. So now our data table is complete. The one area where this is going to help us the most is data validation. I call it dynamic data validation. That's coming up in tip number 5. So stick around for that's going to come to pay off for us. So we have our data. Now it's time to do lookup functions, to write some lookup functions so we can start comparing different players and their statistics. What some people may do in this case is just grab some extra real estate over here to the right of the table. We're not going to do that. Tip number 3 for today is for Excel organization and project organization in general. It is a good idea in your Excel projects to try and keep your data and your reporting, so in this case, a lookup function is an example of reporting, separate, and really keep them on separate sheets. There are a number of reasons for this. First of all, if we actually put lookup functions over here and we wanted to expand this data table or add columns to it, we would run out of real estate pretty quickly. We would also run into some problems if we wanted to do so many lookup functions that we started putting them in different areas of the page. You actually have to write also more complicated lookup functions to make sure you're not accidentally selecting other functions you have going on in the sheet. It's much cleaner if you keep your data in one sheet and then all of your lookup functions, anything that's not the raw data, in another sheet. You're actually following good computer science guidelines of, say, how to organize databases or how to program tools or object-oriented programming. You're following those rules by doing this. So it's highly recommended. The reason why a lot of people don't do this, though, is because they don't know how you can see both at the same time. It can be kind of challenging to be writing a function, looking up data you can't see. So you have to go keep going back and forth and kind of remember what it looks like. Tip number 4 is the way around that. We can actually look at both our data sheet, which I'm going to rename right now. This is our data. And we're going to create a new sheet here for reporting. This is the player comparison tool. We can look at both sheets at the same time. Here's how you do that. In the ribbon, you need to go over to the View section of the ribbon, or the View ribbon, and go over to New Window. You see, this window right here, this is just, look at this right now. It says Lookup and Look Great. That's what I've named the file. If we go to New Window here, it now has, now we're looking at, it says Lookup and Look Great 2. Why does it say that? Well, Lookup and Look Great 1 is over here. So we have 2 windows within the same workbook. We need to see them both at the same time. You use the Excel function here, arrange all, which is right next to that new window button we just used, and arrange them however you'd like. I like to go vertical so you don't use up as much ribbon space. Horizontal might work in this case. because we have a little bit of a wide data table. So let's go with horizontal. And you see now our windows are organized. I'm actually going to shrink it down and show only the tabs and shrink the formula bar on the lower window here. And this will be where we look at our data. Since we're mostly going to be working in this upper section here to write our lookup functions, I'll leave the ribbon fully expanded here. We're not taking up too much real estate, but now we can write whatever function we want in the player comparison tool tab and just click down here into the data tab. It's as if they're in the same sheet, but they're not. So we're keeping them separate. All right, so I'm gonna start to build out the tool here. So I'm gonna have player 1 and player 2 are gonna have their names in columns next to each other. You're gonna have the player name here, and I'm gonna be comparing fantasy points. So when I select a player, if my lookup function is going to work, what I need to do is I need to type in the player's name exactly as it appears in the data table. And that can be difficult to do when the player name is combined with his team and his position. It's not always obvious, in football stats how these get tagged. So I want to have a way to make sure I always have the right entry and I'm not comparing a player that's just not listed or a player that his name was typed wrong. Which brings us to tip number 5. Dynamic data validation. Data validation is making sure that what you type into a cell is quote unquote valid. To apply data validation to a cell, you go up into the ribbon, the data ribbon, and move over to data validation, which is one of the data tools functions here. And the first option here is data validation. There are a number of different forms of data validation, but because we have a list of player names that we want to choose from, what we want to allow is a list. And this is where it gets interesting. A lot of times when you have data validation lists, you'll see people will just type a list somewhere in the spreadsheet, like maybe it's just in these random cells off to the side here. They'll highlight that and that's a list of values. You could also manually type in your options here where you say Joe, Jim, etc., Bob. And if I were to hit enter and go back into this cell, you can see Joe, Jim, and Bob's names are there. But that's not good enough. We want to be able to refer to all the players in this table. And if we expanded this table and went beyond the top 25 quarterbacks, data validation list to update automatically. The way you do that in your data validation prompt here under list is you have to use a function. The function is the indirect function. You go indirect, open parentheses and double quotes. And now we're going to refer to, is one of the advantages to formatting as a table here, we're going to refer to table 1. Within table 1, let's scroll around here so we know what we're actually looking at. Within table 1, our options, we want the options to be in the player column, the player field. So now that goes in brackets. So we have player. That's the actual column we're going to refer to. So it's a confusing syntax for this function here, but it'll work. Okay, well. Because we made a table a second time there, actually it's called table 2. So we got to fix this to be table 2. That's what the problem was. All right, so now for player 1 here, we have a drop down and we have all the quarterbacks that are in the list. If I were to go down here, and add a quarterback or just add anything to this data table, one of the nice things about data tables is if you just paste data, it will assume that you're adding to the table. But I'm just going to type it in here and call this Frank. I go back up here because I typed in the player column, Frank is in there. And that's our dynamic data validation list to get the right player entries. Obviously, I don't actually want Frank's name here. That was just there for an example. So I'm going to delete that. And we're going to have Josh Allen as the beginning of our comparison. I want to be able to compare this for player 2. So my options here, I can copy and paste the cell over, or just a quick callback to tip number 1, I can do a paste special here and just paste the data validation, which is paste special. It's actually in another one for, if you keep going into the paste special, you see all the answers, and N is paste the data validation. So now I pasted just the data validation and saved myself didn't really save myself anything, actually added time here, but now I can also add Brock Purdy. I just wanted to show how you could paste data validation as a paste special. All right, the time has come now for the meat of the sandwich here, the main course, lookup functions. We're going to use XLOOKUP. Lookup functions for a long time in Excel were synonymous with the VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP functions. There actually is another function called just lookup, and that one is maybe it's the earliest iteration of it. I never found it very useful. It was a little bit before my time. VLOOKUP and HLOOKUP were synonymous with being an Excel expert for a long time, but they've been supplanted by other functions. Index and match in combination was a better way to do lookup functions for a long time. It still is, actually, but there are better ways now than even using index match to do lookup functions. XLOOKUP will cover about 90% of lookups that most Excel users will need to do. What XLOOKUP does is XLOOKUP will look up a value. In this case, we're going to be looking up Josh Allen first here. I'm going to just type this in, XLOOKUP. It takes a lookup values, for example, Josh Allen. It looks up Josh Allen's name in an array, so that is going to be a column or a series of cells. And I'm going to select here column A to A within the data workbook here. I could also just select within the column and do table to player. In this case, both will work. Word to the wise, I most often, when I'm doing XLOOKUP, will just use the entire column. After taking the column where it's going to look for Josh Allen's name, it needs to know what value to return to you. So you have to select another column for it to count back on. So I've selected column A. Now, if I want to select another column to return an answer, if I want fantasy points, I select now column D. That's the return array. Now, there are some optional arguments in the syntax for XLOOKUP. That just means there are things you could specify for it, but you don't need to. The first of these, and the one that is most often used, and actually can be very useful, is what you want the function to say if it doesn't find the value you're looking up. We're not going to have that problem because we've used the data validation function on our input cell, on our lookup value. But if we wanted it to return a message to us, this is where we would enter it. If you want to enter something that says like, not found, in double quotes, you would put not found. If you wanted to return just a blank, in double quotes, you would put nothing. That's how Excel interprets a blank. And we can actually leave that there as just part of the function. So now Josh Allen, you see his fantasy points are 421.64. But to demonstrate also how XLOOKUP can also go to the left, unlike VLOOKUP does not only go to the right, XLOOKUP goes to the left. So we're going to do XLOOKUP, and we're actually going to look up this fantasy points number as our lookup value. The lookup array is going to be column D, and our return array is going to be column A, and it gives us Josh Allen. There are very little reasons why you would use VLOOKUP now that XLOOKUP exists, but there are reasons why you may want to use functions besides XLOOKUP. Specifically, you may want to use index match. Index match is the function combination to use if you need to look up not just vertically, but horizontally in a data set. What that would mean here is we have this player lookup tool. I'm actually going to zoom in here for the rest of the video because why not? We have Josh Allen's name. We want to look up Josh Allen in the table. We specified fantasy points just by selecting column D, but let's say we wanted to be able to choose a different column. Well, that can work as well. Fantasy points here is, as we have typed it in, does not match the column header here. The first thing we need to do is need to apply data validation like we did in tip number 5. Make sure that our statistic name matches one of the column headers. The way you do this with our data table, it's very similar to before. You go to the data ribbon, you bring our data validation link here, click the data validation button here, you go to allow a list, and our source, what we're going to do here, we need the indirect function, open parentheses, open double quotes, table 2, because that's the table we're working in. And now instead of selecting a column, because we're selecting from the headers, we have to do hashtag headers. Hashtag headers and close brackets, close double quotes, close parentheses. Now when we want to select something, it didn't delete our previous entry, but now if we want to enter something different, fan points is what we have to actually enter. And what we can do now is we can use fan points as it's been entered to go interrogate this value and then potentially change it as we go. So the way the index function works, the index function's purpose in the index max combination is to show what range of cells or what table you are looking for your information within, both the columns and the rows. So we're going to start by putting an index function here. The array itself is, in this case, table 2. If you're liking using a data table at this point instead of using just a range and using cell references, I honestly will use a data table in almost every instance except when I'm dealing with a very large data set. Maybe a very large data set with a lot of functions, because it does kind of slow down certain computers. You know, maybe your work computer isn't super fast. So if you're dealing with speed issues, maybe you don't want to use data tables, but in most instances, data tables are very nice. So we're indexing table 2, and we need to use the match function to get the right row number. This is where Josh Allen's name is determining the correct row number. But before I start typing the match function, as I would have done for almost my entire life up until maybe a year or so ago, I'm going to use the newer function, and that's tip number 8, index XMATCH. The XMATCH function saves us a little bit of time here. It's an improved match function that assumes you're looking for an exact match, whereas the previous match function, you had to tell it, look for an exact match. So I type in the XMatch function here, and what we want to do is match Josh Allen's name in the rows so that the function knows how many rows to count down to go find the data we want. So the XMatch function takes the lookup value of Josh Allen's name, and for a lookup array, we can select, we don't want the whole table here, table 2, we can just select table 2 here, and player column. So you see the player columns in brackets, and it will find Josh Allen's name. In this case, it's actually the XMatch function is going to return a value of 1 because Josh Allen's name is the first entry, there's the first row. And our index function now, when it gives us an answer, is going to look in row number 1. That's how that actually works. So the XMatch function here, it basically becomes the number 1 and then feeds back into index. Closing now the XMatch function for the rows. We're looking now for the columns. We can type in the XMatch function again because we're going to be matching our column name here, and we are looking across the headers of the column. I will note that the headers themselves are not actually part of our index here. The table 2 index is just the data. But because the match function is simply counting across, because we know it starts in the same column and ends in the same column, we know we're going to get the answer we want. So it's going to look for fan points in the column header. In this case, it's going to return an answer of 4 because that's where fan points is found. It's the 4th column here. Our index function now knows to go to row 1, column 4. That's our answer. So if we hit enter, you see there are the fantasy points there. We're really starting to cook with gas here, right? We want to be able to enter multiple statistics. So let's copy down this statistical, data validation cell and do some cool things here. We got pass yards, we got passing touchdowns, and we want to be able to apply this. We want to be able to apply this to player 2 as well. Well, it'd be nice if we could just drag the function down, right? Well, see, we can't necessarily do that. So if we want our index match function to be able to drag across and not have to type it again, brings us to tip number 9, which is the use of absolute cell references. We have a few different types of absolute cell references we're going to use here. Cell B3's function here of this index match function has a few cell references, including these colorized cells here. So this blue cell, that is cell B2. You can see that's called out in the XMatch function that's looking in the rows, but it's looking for cell B2. If we drag this function down and take another look at the function here, you see now it's looking in cell B3. It assumed that we were looking just for the cell above where we have the function typed, and that's not right. We always want to be looking in row 2. So the way we ensure that the function is referring to row 2 is make row 2 an absolute reference. So we can put a $sign here in front of the number 2. Now if we drag the function down, it will stay up here in cell B2 as far as reference is concerned, and it's now looking for pass yards for Josh Allen as opposed to looking for pass yards for player name 421.64, which doesn't make any sense. This actually does work now if we want to drag it all the way down to passing touchdowns. We have some more absolute references to go because we want to be able to drag across to Brock Purdy. You might have guessed that we want this red cell to stay over here as fan points. So we want an absolute reference on cell A3. So we want to have a $sign up there. Quick way to add the $signs, by the way, is with the F4 key. Just keep hitting F4 and everything kind of gets toggles there. Just keep doing that until it looks the way you want. So we want column A to be an absolute reference. We do not want row 3 to be an absolute reference because as we drop the function down, we don't want to stay in row 3 here. We want to go row by row with the different statistical references. We just want to stay in column A when we move to the right. But you see, it still doesn't work here. That's pretty curious, right? Well, you see how this function actually changed? The function here we have in cell B3 is referring to table 2, and it's doing an XMatch in the player column, and it's doing an XMatch in the headers. When we go over here, suddenly now it's doing an XMatch in the GP, or the games played column, and that's not right. The way you absolute reference a table name like that, it's kind of a funny way of doing it, but what you need to do, take the column name in brackets, do colon, the column name again, in brackets. So we got player here, colon player. And then because that's not enough brackets, you put more brackets around it. So within brackets, you got the column name in brackets, column name in brackets. And that works as an absolute reference. That's the table version of adding dollar signs. If that doesn't make a lot of sense to you, note that when anywhere in Excel, like what we did in our XLOOKUP function back in tip number 6, look it up, say A2, I'm just gonna do here for the sake of visualization, it considers column J to be columns J colon J. So that's just kind of how it works. It's from columns J to J. And if you have it in brackets here, it's just gonna be sticky. I don't have that much more to say about this. I'm not thrilled with how long that takes to enter, but that's how you do absolute references for tables. Now, if we drag this across, we got the fantasy point totals for Brock Purdy, and we can bring this down, and we got this references to the cells we want. Pass touchdowns for Brock Purdy, it's referring to the right fields, and it's giving us the total number of touchdown passes that Brock Purdy threw. 31 touchdowns this year? This is starting to look like we want it. Let's say these are the 3 stats we want to actually compare. And I wanted to make have this look nice, so I'm gonna take a moment here just to, bold the selections and do a few things here that make it look like it's actually some time has been spent. I think things look nice. I'm gonna make these center aligned. This doesn't look quite as nice as I'd like it to. Let's say I want this to look like a table, but I don't want to create a data table here. I don't need to make a data table here. This is not a data table. But it'd be cool if the header row were colorized and I had the, alternating gray and white rows here. So this is another mini tip. What we're going to do here is we are going to use the format as table function in Excel to format this data, turn it back into a range. Pretty straightforward. Once we create the table so we can format it as table here, maybe we want this to be blue because blue goes well with orange. Although the channel colors are green, so maybe I should have gone with that. We are now a table, and we want to go back. Up here in this new section of the ribbon that popped up here, table design. As long as I have this selected, or as long as I'm selected somewhere in the table, this is an option in your Excel ribbon. I can go down here to convert to range. I can turn the table back into a range. Is for whatever reason is asking me again if that's what I want to do. I'm going to say yes. And now we just have nicely formatted cells. So that's a nice little formatting tip. There's one more formatting thing I want to do here. I want the greater statistic between the 2 players I'm comparing to be green. So I'm going to do that. That brings us to tip number 10 for the day. Conditional format, custom rules. I'm going to start here with 1 cell. I could spend a lot of time explaining how conditional formatting functions are different from regular functions. With the interest of time, I'm going to just mostly demonstrate this. So when you're applying a custom formatting rule here, what you want to do is start by selecting just 1 cell and go up to conditional formatting, which is in the home ribbon. Go to conditional formatting, and you can just go right down to new rule. You want to use a formula to determine which cells to format. This is where we're going to type in the formula that lets us know if this cell should be green or not. I'm going to intentionally do the wrong thing here. I'm going to enter a conditional format formula where it just equals cell B3 is greater than cell C3. And I'm going to format this, and if that happens, I want to turn it green. Now, again, fair warning, this is the wrong thing to do. I'm going to show you why. So if we apply this to conditional format, this cell is turned green because it's a greater number. If I choose a different quarterback who has presumably less fantasy points, like Bryce Young, it is not green. Actually need to expand these cells here. So it's working so far. If I go back to Josh Allen here, if I want to apply this rule now, though, to all the cells that I have in the table, the best way to apply a conditional format rule to a range of cells is go back up to conditional formatting, go to manage rules. Here it will show all the conditional formats you either have on your current selection, or you can select, say, this entire worksheet. And I'm going to change what cells this applies to. As this applies to different cells, it's going to, because I didn't use absolute references when I typed in my initial formula, it's going to apply the function for each cell by looking to the cell to the right of it. If I select this whole area and hit apply, it appears to be doing what we want for the Josh Allen column. It's turning them all green except for the pass touchdowns because Brock Purdy had more touchdowns than Josh Allen did. But it's also turned all of Brock Purdy's cells green. And the reason why it's done that is because 326.6, for example, is greater than 0, which is what's in cell D3, which is to the right. We could make 2 separate rules. We could make another rule here for Brock Purdy's cells to say it's greater than the cell to the left. But then if we want to make this a player comparison of 3 players, that wouldn't work anymore. So what we're going to do is a slightly more sophisticated formula on the conditional format. I just like it being in the cell I was initially in when I set the rule. And go to manage rules. Select your rule and edit it. The rule that I'm going to replace this with is a rule that states if this value that we're in now. So cell B3 is equal to the max. Fancy puts that in that row. So in that case, we have the max function. So B3 is equal to the max of from B3 to C3. When I go to the right, I want to stay on B3 to C3. So it has to be an absolute reference on B and an absolute reference on C. Now, because it's absolute, I need to actually type the number 3 here. If I apply this function, and it actually now works. And the reason why it's worked is because the absolute references on the column meant that when you move over to Brock Purdy's column, it's still comparing columns B and C. When you move down in rows, though, it moves with it because the row is not absolute. Obviously, there are ways that this function may need to be further advanced to accommodate more columns. The reference would then have to go out to, say, column D. But the basics now I've shown you for how to do this conditional format by formula. One thing I'll add to, and I kind of glossed over this, when you have this formula, you kind of have this superfluous equal sign here. That's just, it might not make a lot of sense by saying equals B3 equals max, like that it's kind of being repeated, but that's just how it takes the entry here. For today's video, we're just gonna say that's how it works. And we're almost done here. Let's say I wanted to share this with a friend, or let's say I worked in the sports industry, I wanted to share this with a coworker. Let's say, you know, we're all kind of new to Excel or something like that, a bunch of old sports writers, I don't know. And I don't want them to break these functions. These functions, maybe they took a little bit of effort, and the person I'm sending this to is very likely to accidentally delete the function or not know how this works. What I want to do before I send it over is apply tip number 11, which is sheet protections. Microsoft Excel gives you a number of different ways you could protect. Microsoft Excel allows you to protect your workbook, means the password protect it upon opening, but it also allows you to password protect or just simply protect individual sheets. And that's what we're gonna do here. Our data sheet. There's no reason why anyone would change any of the data here. And we really want this to work. We don't want just to be adding a bunch of data and changing data. We don't want that. The data is fixed. The data are fixed. So I'm gonna right click here and I'm going to hit protect sheet. I could apply a password if I wanted. Always be careful when you apply a password to anything in Excel, though. Those passwords are very tough to recover if you forget them, especially if you're on a corporate computer and you don't have admin rights. So often what I'll do is I'll just protect it without a password and trust that if someone knows enough to unprotect the sheet, they also know enough to not with it. So I'm gonna hit OK. I can actually hide the data sheet now. I don't even need to really look at it unless I were really perusing here. So I'm gonna hide this sheet. Now, and I'm actually gonna now go bring up this larger window here and focus entirely on this little tiny tool we made. I want to protect this sheet, but I want the users to still be able to use the drop downs here. So I'm going to select the cells I want them to be able to actually play around with. So I've selected here Brock Purdy, Josh Allen, fantasy points, pass yards, pass touchdowns. And I'm going to format these cells so that they are not locked. What that means is I can apply different rules to them when I protect the sheet. So I'm going to uncheck locked. Every cell is by default locked when you protect your sheet. But because they're now no longer locked, when I go to protect this sheet here, whoops, hit view code. I don't need to do that today. Player comparison tool, I can go to protect sheet and I'm going to allow them to select unlocked cells. I don't want them to even select the locked cells because that's not the point. So I'm going to uncheck that. I'm going to apply a password. Like I said, no need to get cute. I'm going to hit OK. And now they can't, now as the worksheet is now, even I can't select it until I unprotect it again. You can't even click on these cells. You can only click on the cells where you can change the drop downs, but you preserve all the functions here where you can change the statistics to say, all right, rush yards, compare Josh Allen and Brock Purdy. And that brings us to the end of today's project. Lookup and Look Great, 11 tips for Excel lookup function projects. If you want to get really good at Excel, subscribe to Excel Smart. I'm going to be sharing everything I know about Microsoft Excel on this channel over the coming months, and with a focus on showing tips within projects and focusing on applicability and not just showing off the advanced things in Excel that you're never going to use. See you in the next one. Don't just Excel, Excel Smart.